Welcome to Vienna. This usually rates today as the single best city in the world to live in. But Vienna is a city with a lot of history. Much of it is horrible. We, as a Jewish Historical Institute, want to look at that history with you. And what we want to do is look at the greatness that Jews achieved here, and we want to look at the horrors that happened to them. Now, it's been said that there is no such thing as Jewish history in Central Europe. History is something that was done to Jews. So let's go explore that together. When we speak of Vienna's Golden Age, there's certainly no better place to start than here. This is the Secession. It was an artist collective built actually as a temporary structure at first, the end of the 19th century, to house the work of some of the great contemporary artists of Vienna then. When we speak of the Jewish contributions to Vienna's Golden Age, which lasted, let's say, from the 1880s, 1890s until the First World War and perhaps a little beyond, that's when we speak of the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's when we talk about the fiction that came from Arthur Schnitzler and a little bit later from Stefan Zweig. This is when we speak of the plays and the writings of Karl Kraus. And when it comes to women, there was Madame Dora, who made her name as a photographer a little bit later in Paris, and Lisa Meitner, the scientist, who would move on to Berlin, where she made major discoveries. In music, we had Gustav Mahler, who turned his dreams into music, and Arnold Schoenberg, who completely rewrote what music was meant to sound like when he composed it. Now, just north of Vienna, we had Franz Kafka in Prague, who wrote in German, was Jewish, and he turned his nightmares into fiction. And whether you had nightmares or whether you had dreams, there was one man in Vienna who you went to see. We're going to go visit him now. Dreams, nightmares, no matter what you had, this is where you brought them. For the talking cure of Dr. Sigmund Freud, Burgasse number 19, the most famous address in psychoanalysis. Now, many of the ideas that Sigmund Freud had then have now been discredited, cast aside. But what he said about our defense mechanisms and about the unconscious mind, these things still hold true today. If you're interested in the Jewish history of Vienna, there's no better place to start than in the Vienna Jewish Museum on Dorotheastrasse. This is one of the great Jewish museums of Europe, and it is filled with surprises, very important art, great artifacts, and it tells its stories very well. From the archive or the depot on the top floor, filled with Judaica from synagogues long destroyed, to its permanent exhibition that will walk you through the entire history of Viennese Jewry, to its temporary exhibitions as well. It's all here. And so is, by the way, this bicycle, which was Theodor Herzl's bike. We're going to look at 3 places and look at 3 items that mean a lot to Austria's early 20th century. And there will be the gloves, the car, and the woman. We're in the Jewish Museum of Vienna right now, and we're looking at Julius Brot's white leather driving gloves. Julius Brot, who was Jewish and from Bohemia, was given the honor of driving the royal train on the 27th of June, 1914, when he delivered Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, to Sarajevo. The very next day, well, we'll look at that when we get to our next place. Julius Brot delivered Franz Ferdinand and his wife by royal train from the Adriatic coast up to Sarajevo, or a suburb of it called Ilija. That is where they spent the night. The next day, they rode in this car into Sarajevo, and this is the car in which they were assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. Now, when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, it wasn't that big of a deal because he had no friends at the royal court in Vienna. He had very few friends anywhere. He just had one important friend, and it was the wrong friend, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. 37 days after he was shot, Europe had gone to war. In the Jewish Museum, we saw the gloves that Julius Brot was wearing when he delivered Franz Ferdinand to Sarajevo. And then in the Military Museum, we saw the actual car in which they were riding when they were assassinated. And this modest dwelling here behind me, that's the Belvedere. This is where they lived. This was at least the official residence. Now, Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne, waiting for the death of the aged Emperor Franz Joseph, who was in 1914, 84 years old. This is where his shadow cabinet was working. And on the 28th of June, they received word that the boss, Franz Ferdinand, would not be coming home. Austria was plunged into the First World War. By the end of the war, there was no Austro-Hungarian Empire. And after the First World War, this building, the Belvedere, became a museum. This is where we bring into the picture Ferdinand Bloch and his wife Adela Bloch-Bauer. Now, Ferdinand was extremely wealthy. He was a banker and he was a sugar magnate. Now, being a sugar magnate in Vienna at that time was like being an oil man in Texas. Adela Bloch-Bauer adored the work of Gustav Klimt, and Ferdinand commissioned Klimt not once but twice to paint his wife. Here's one of the paintings he painted of Adela in 1912. And then a few years before that, though, Klimt produced The Lady in Gold, one of the great paintings of the Secessionist era. Now, Adela decided that she wanted her painting to be donated to this museum upon her death. It was her wish, but she didn't actually own it. And she died young, at the age of 43 in 1925, and what happened after that is what I'm going to show you next. When we speak about the Blockbauer family, the best person to talk with is the attorney Randy Schoenberg. So Randy, I think this is an address that you know fairly well?
Yes, this is Elisabethstrasse 18, where the Blockbauers live, Ferdinand and Adela. They lived on the first floor up above, and the higher floors were used as the offices for his big sugar company, so that's where he ran all of that business. Adela died, unfortunately, in 1925 of meningitis, and after that, Ferdinand kept all of the Klimt paintings, the 2 portraits and 4 landscapes, in one room, and there were always fresh cut flowers that Ferdinand bought to put in this room for Adele. That was all here. They had dozens of other paintings, of course, and an enormous porcelain collection. In 1939, after Ferdinand fled, they had a meeting in the house, they being the Nazis. So there was a Nazi official, a lawyer, who was liquidating Ferdinand's estate, and he invited members of all of the museums, and as well as the Gestapo and the tax authorities, and even Adolf Hitler sent a representative to this meeting in January 1939 in this house. And at that meeting, they divided up all of the artworks in Ferdinand's collection, the Klimt paintings and dozens of other paintings, and decided where they would go, to which museum. Hitler had very conservative tastes, so he didn't like the Klimt paintings. He took an old-fashioned painting from the 19th century. But the Klimt paintings were really of interest to the Austrian museums. They were salivating over them, and so they divided them up amongst themselves.
Well, this is Heldenplatz. This is the Hofburg. This was the last great residence of the Habsburg family, although they actually never moved in. It had never been completed, or wasn't completed, before 1918, when the empire collapsed. Now, at the end of the First World War, the victorious Allies, which believed in the right of self-determination, let the Czechs and the Slovaks form their own country. The Slovenes and Croats then joined in with the Serbs to create what would become known as Yugoslavia, and other parts of the empire came away. What was Austria? The French premier Clemenceau says, "What's left?" This country was tiny. Nobody here particularly wanted their own country. Only 8% of the land was tillable. Most of the farmland had been in Hungary. There was no industry. Most of the industry had been in the Czech Republic, in Bohemia, in what was called Sudetenland. This was a deeply unhappy country that was formed, and the conservatives, the blacks, ruled the countryside, the socialists ruled the cities. There was a civil war in 1934 which put an end to democracy, and that was the beginning of what was called Austrofascism. In 1938, Adolf Hitler just sent the German troops in. The Austrians didn't even fire a shot in protest. This square here was filled with hundreds of thousands of Viennese when Adolf Hitler spoke on that balcony right there. And that would be the beginning of the death grip that Austria was in with Nazi Germany. Not a single Jew in the country, of course, came here that day. From that minute on, they were going to flee for their lives. And that's what we'll see next. March of 1938 came. The Germans were here. Jews were thrown out of their jobs, fired, couldn't go to school. Every Jewish family was desperate to get out. And then came November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or Reichspogromnacht. That is when every Jewish family was desperate to get out. The problem was nobody wanted to take them. But in England, they agreed to take 10,000 Jewish children if they were unaccompanied. And so here in Westbahnhof, where we are now, in Westbahnhof, hundreds upon hundreds of parents brought their children to this station to put them on trains. And they would be on those trains and go to England, and most of those children would never see their parents again. Well, this grim place is the Matthausen concentration camp. We're about 2.5 hours west of Vienna, and this is where, during the Third Reich, 190,000 prisoners were interned. Of those, 90,000 of them were worked to death, starved to death, or were shot. There were 5,000 SS men who worked here, and 4,000 in the surrounding camps. Compare that to only 6,500 at Auschwitz. Of the prisoner population that was here, only around 25,000 to 35,000 of those were Jewish. Most of those met gruesome ends. And here's what we know about those Jewish prisoners. Most of them were sent here to Matthausen at the very end of the war, after they had already been sent to other concentration camps and served in labor brigades. They arrived here barely half alive, and this is where many of them just perished, if not worked to death, then from sheer exhaustion. While we're at Matthausen, I'll tell you a story. It actually takes place in Jasper, Alabama, early 1950s. Now, a town like Jasper could not afford a full-time rabbi, and the head of the congregation, George Mitnick, had asked for Hebrew Union College, which trained rabbis up in Cincinnati, to send a rabbinical student down and lead the services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And George Mitnick went to the train station on the appointed date, and a young man by the name of Hugo Green got off the train. Green shook his hand, and Mitnick introduced himself, and Hugo said, "George Mitnick, I know you. I know your name." And Mitnick said, "You don't know my name. Never met." And Mitnick drove him to the small hotel in Jasper, and Hugo Green went upstairs, laid his documents on the bed, and changed for the services that night. And then one document caught his eye. He brought it downstairs with him. And he said, "Mr. Mitnick, actually, you and I'm not sure we met, but you definitely signed an important document for me, and this is what it is. This is my release papers from the Matthausen concentration camp, which you signed." As it turns out that George Mitnick had been one of the liberators in the U.S. Army of the Matthausen concentration camp, but he never spoke about it, never talked about it with his own children. But this is the story that he passed down to us. We know that 65,000 Jews here in Austria were murdered. 120,000 at least or more went fleeing for their lives, but it's not like they escaped. They left everything behind. Educations that were not completed. Of course, all the businesses were Aryanized, whether they were small shopkeepers or wealthy bankers. And one of the families that had everything taken from them was the family that lived in this home. This is the Fruzzi Palais. The Fruzis had, back at the turn of the last century, been one of the wealthiest families in Europe. They had rivaled the Rothschilds. They had come from Berdichev in what is now Ukraine, moved to Odessa where they went into banking and the exportation of wheat. In fact, they were the largest exporters of wheat in the world. Part of the family moved to Paris, another part moved to Vienna. Now, Charles, who lived in Paris in 1899, sent 264 of those elegant small netsuke, the Japanese figurines, that he gave to his brother for his wedding present. That was his brother, Victor. Victor brought his wife, Emmy, here to the palace. Emmy had said, it's like the lobby of the Vienna Opera. But in 1938, the Nazis stormed into the building. Victor and Emmy had to go on the run. Everything in it was Aryanized. Emmy killed herself in a home that they owned in Czechoslovakia, and Victor ended up in the Netherlands and then in Tunbridge Wells in England, where he had family. Their daughter Elizabeth did come back after the war. She'd been trained as an attorney, and although she did get back the house and some of the artwork, she sold it all off. But when she came back after the war, she found Anna, the maid. The night the Nazis had come into the house, in 1938, scooped up those 264 netsuke and hid them under her mattress for the entire duration of the war. And all this is the story that Edmund de Waal, Elizabeth's grandson, tells in his moving portrait, The Hare with the Amber Eyes, which describes the rise and the fall of the Fruzis family. The Second World War came to an end in Austria in May of 1945 when the Soviet army took the city. And for the next 10 years, Austria was an occupied country. It was occupied by the Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French, who agreed to leave in 1955 in exchange for Austria becoming a neutral country. Now, all during this time, the Austrians began telling themselves the story that they had been the first victims of Nazism, and a great many people here believed it. No one else did. And this is where we begin to talk about how countries face their past. Now, my country, I'm an American, doesn't face its past particularly well, and I'm sure your country doesn't face its past very well. But the Austrians had reached almost Olympic proportions of forgetting its past when they elected in 1986 to the presidency, that's what we see here, Kurt Waldheim, a man who had lied and denied his Nazi past. Now, when that happened in 1986, after that, journalists became much more aggressive about looking into the past of Austria in the 1930s and 40s. And not only that, teachers became much more truthful about teaching Holocaust in every school in the country. Museums then began pulling things down off of the walls and giving them back to the rightful owners. Property was then given back also. Now, let's go back to Randy Schoenberg because he was representing the last heir to the Blockbauer family, Maria Altmann. And the Belvedere was one museum that wasn't feeling it needed to return those Klimt paintings. So at the end of the 1990s, Randy went to work.
We went through discovery and the things that lawyers do, and then finally Austria agreed to do something that I had asked them to do 7 years earlier, which was an arbitration. They said they wanted to bring the case back to Austria, have Austrian judges decide it. And at first Maria said, no way, I don't want to have my case decided in Austria. But at that point, the case had been going on for 6 years, and I said to Maria, if you want this case decided in your lifetime, we have to take the chance. And so she allowed me to come back to Austria, and I did an arbitration. And amazingly, they came back with a verdict that we were correct, that like Maria's father had said, or the lawyer had said in 1948, this will was just precatory. It wasn't enforceable against Ferdinand or his heirs, and therefore the heirs essentially gave up these paintings in exchange for export permits. And so they ordered the return of these 5 amazing paintings. That was in January 2006, so almost 8 years after we had started the case.
And the battles are still not over. In fact, a branch of the Rothschild family is battling the city of Vienna even today about the assets of a charitable foundation expropriated by the Nazis. The National Fund for Victims of National Socialism was created by the Austrian government in 1995, and that is when Hanna Lessing, a banker, applied for the position of General Secretary.
And when I heard about that job, I asked my father, what would you like to hear from a sort of government office coming to see you and saying, after 60 years, here is a check, or we're sorry, or something like this. And my father actually, for a long time, didn't answer. I think also he didn't really want me to take the job because I was working for a bank, I had a good job. I was working with the future and not only with the dark past. He never told us his story. And so when it was clear that I really wanted to have the job, he had to give me an answer to the question, what would you, as a Holocaust survivor, expect from me, your home country, representative, giving to you after 60 years? And he looked at me and said, Hannah, can you give me back my childhood? Or can you bring back my mother from Auschwitz?
Since its founding in 1995, The National Fund and its affiliated funds have given out over $600 million to Roma, homosexuals, Jews, and the handicapped, and others. The National Fund also sponsors clubs for Holocaust survivors and underwrites educational programs.
Educational project definitely is one of the most important tasks that we all have. And our problem is that the witnesses are passing, or their voices are getting less and less strong. So we need to find a way to give the last chance to the school kids today of meeting them. Because every time when I brought a survivor to a classroom, you could hear a needle drop. These kids will not forget meeting them. It's a joy, it's attentiveness, it's empathy. They learn everything through it. So wherever I can do this, make a school project where I can still involve an eyewitness, this is what we have to do.
Some of those eyewitnesses are still with us, and they meet with each other here in Vienna every chance they get, for stories, for coffee, for strudel. The people you see here, all of them are in their 80s and 90s. That means they survived all that the 20th century could throw at them, and that was quite a lot. The world they had been born into is a world they lost. It's a world everyone lost, and we have tried to pay tribute to them.